All right, welcome everyone. You're here for Rising Organizers Remote Relationship Building for Political Change. Thank you for being here. Let's go ahead and get started. Billy, thank you. So we are Rising Organizers. Go ahead. Who are we? We were founded in 2016, a group of people full of feelings and gumption to go after the 2016 election. And we realized there was a big need to organize people on the left. There was a lot of emotion and a lot of commitment, but we needed that engagement that was going to put people in seats and get people organized. So we've, in that time, since 2016, trained over 2,000 people, and we've run 6 intensive community organizing fellowship classes in cohorts, groups of people like you who come to 8 sessions consecutively to learn basic skills like today's session on relationship building, but also other skills such as, base building, telling one's story. Today's training is an example of the free trainings we offer to the public because we want no barriers to progressive activism. Because very frequently there are, such as, money. And so we don't want this to feel like a hurdle that requires a degree or money. Organizing is for everyone. Organizing has always been about the people, and we're here to provide the skills to help you feel empowered to do that. So we are going to be working as a team to moderate this discussion, and so we'll have staff on the sidelines who are not the presenters monitoring the chat, monitoring to make sure that we don't have any of those Zoom bombing type trolls. So let's just talk through a little bit of our community norms that we can establish amongst ourselves. This training is about getting into forming relationships, and we're going to use some breakout groups and try to make sure that this is not just us talking at you. There's going to be interactivity. So when you go to a breakout room, you'll come back to this main space and leave your breakout. If you should encounter somebody who is being hostile, just put in the chat or email risingorganizers@gmail.com to let us know if you're experiencing any sort of harassment, and we will take that person out, and you should exit that room and come back to the main room. Underline, come back to the main room, do not leave the meeting, okay? So a couple things about norms. We don't have all the answers. We're people like you trying to work with you in community to find answers and to build skills to be better organizers. So we're gonna share that skill set, and we're gonna be kind, and we're gonna ask that you be kind. Again, we'll have a staff member on hand for the troll issue if that should be a thing, but to date, we have not had any Zoom bombs, so fingers crossed, everybody will be on their generally nice to each other behavior. So a thing I would like to emphasize is that we are going to be learning together, but you may do some sharing. What's said here is going to stay here, but what's learned is going to leave. I will like to also note that the training will be recorded and only shared with people who have registered for the training, okay? And that said, the training is so much richer when you participate. So please do use the chat, use the breakouts. We're gonna have a poll. So engage, because that'll make our content so much richer, so much more real. I would like to take a moment and encourage you to just sit with the moment that we're in these times. I would like to do what's called a land acknowledgement. So we as your trainers are actually all in Washington, D.C. today, and like the rest of the country, this is native land that was stolen and built by slave labor. So we just want to acknowledge the Piscataway people who were the original natives on the area that is Washington, D.C. And we encourage you to reflect on wherever you might be and what native peoples might be the people who originally were inhabitants of that land and are probably still there. And we want to acknowledge the continued resilience of native people. A part of that as well, we want to acknowledge and mourn the loss of George Floyd, the 4th life stolen by white supremacist actions this month alone. Our hearts and support go to Black people everywhere, and we stand in solidarity with all Black people demanding justice, and we want for their voices to be heard. I'd just like to take a moment to sit with that, to have that ground us, and feel free to add any norms you would like into the chat, please. I will note when I said hi, we're rising organizers, I forgot to say who I am. Apologies. My name is Katie. I'm one of the training co-directors with my colleagues, Billy and Nancy, here with us today. I will be co-presenting with Shweta, and I just want to share, I am like you. I came to Rising Organizers very fresh in my organizing experience, but did join a fellowship team. I was part of the inaugural cohort, and a fellow is also going to be presenting with me today, so I'll hand off to Shweta to introduce herself, please.
Hello, my name is Shweta Haldar, and I am currently part of the Rising Organizers Community Organizing Fellowship for the spring this year. And yeah, and I'm bringing some of like the knowledge fresh from the fellowship. So it's been a really cool opportunity. So yeah, next slide. Oh, sorry, Katie, do you have more you wanted to say?
I would just like to flag if Billy has seen anything in the chat to uplift any of the norms that have been shared in the chat. So
no new norms so far.
Okay.
But if any, add some into the chat as you'd like.
Yeah, feel free, whatever's comfortable with you all, and it can be throughout the session. Don't feel like it has to be at this one moment. And I'll hand it over to Shweta. Thank you.
Great, thanks, Katie. So yeah, so now we're gonna go into breakout rooms so you can get to know each other and sort of discuss who you are and what brought you to this training and what kinds of goals and interests are bringing you to this space today. So we're gonna divide everyone into breakout rooms. If you don't see anyone in your breakout room, just hold tight and we'll put you into a different one, and let us know through the chat if you encounter any tech difficulties. Great. So, do you want to move to the next slide? Is everyone back from their breakout rooms? Looks like it. So yeah, so does anyone want to share something they discussed in their breakout room? Feel free to either say it, like unmute yourself, or put it into the chat.
Well, I found a fellow mutual aid NDC person, but in Ward 4, and I'm in Ward 5. So that was nice to find someone who's helping in the mutual aid cause.
Feel free to unmute yourself or write it. Oh. So we just got a chat from Katie. Excited to see mutual aid here. I'm also in Ward 5. So it looks like people are identifying common interests just in our breakout rooms. Great, okay, so we'll move on to the, more. So from Paula, was nice to meet some like-minded folks looking to learn how to engage folks. And we'll discuss more about that throughout the training. Great, so we'll start this training by discussing some of the basics of organizing so we have a common vocabulary. Next slide. So what is organizing? So in Rising Organizers, we define organizing as building and shaping power to change politics. And we think of power as completely value neutral. Like power can bring a lot of associations to mind, but we don't think of it as good or bad. Power is the ability to act and achieve purpose. And so can anyone think of, and power can come from either money or from the people you have supporting you. So can anyone think of people or institutions who derive their power from their money? If you do, please put it into the chat. Yep. So we have the police force, anyone powerful, JCN, the government. So these are institutions or people, fossil fuel corps, institutions or people that are getting their power from their money, corporations. So another way of driving power is through the people you have organized supporting you. So can you think of like people or institutions that are deriving their power from their people power, from like political power, from having people behind them rather than from organized money? Rising organizers. BLM, absolutely. Black Lives Matter, yeah. Nonprofits. Yeah, these are all BLM ACT UP. Yeah, so these are all really, really good examples. Color for Change. It's like a lot of like nonprofit and like organized, like, you know, people-led organizations rather than grassroots political campaigns. Yeah, so power is, so these are all examples of how power can take very different forms and it can look very different. Like all power is the ability to achieve your purpose. And power is not static, and who has the power can shift based on how many people are organizing behind them. Like the more people you have organized, the more power you have to act and to achieve your purpose. So are there any examples people can think of how the power has changed or shifted on a particular issue or in a particular area right now or in the past? Like who holds the power in a particular area or issue? AOC. So AOC has power and is an example. So yes, the BDS movement in Palestine. We have gun violence. So the power has shifted from the NRA to the Parkland organizers, abortion restrictions, which is an interesting example of how power has shifted a lot over time from Minnesotans protesting police brutality. So these are all examples of how power can shift over time and based on the number of people you have organizing behind you. Yeah, so next, another example is the Fight for 15 movement, where power has shifted, shifted historically from like restaurant lobbying groups and business lobbying groups to organizers and has resulted in a lot of political change. Next slide. Oh, great. Okay, so this is like a handy little graphic organizer of how power can shift. So when people are acting individually, there's like people more powerful than them can eat them. But when like the little fish sort of collectively organize, they can take down the big fish. So that's the sort of like an example of what people power looks like. So next slide. Yeah, and so this is like one of the main ways people and institutions can derive power, organize money. So oil firms spend like ridiculous amounts of money on climate lobbying, and this is an example of power being derived from money. And next slide. And to contend with that level of organized money, you need lots of organized people. So here are examples of really effective movements of organized people: Black Lives Matter, Fight for 15, Everytown for gun safety, often dealing with very, very well-funded, lots and lots of organized money, like police unions, restaurant lobbying groups, the NRA. Next slide. So a lot of us have been to protests, and protests are like, so organizing people is so that they're powerful enough to contend with organized money means like building relationships. So many of us have gone to marches, protests, direct actions, but that's not the same thing as actually being organized. That's being mobilized. And having like the real one-on-one relationships with people is the building block of how to organize. And relationships make your movement more sustainable. So I'm gonna ask a question and we're gonna do a poll. How many of you have gone to a protest since 2016 and been contacted for a one-on-one conversation by an organizer afterwards? So it sounds like not a lot of people. It's like 77%, not me, frowny face. So, so that's like a really good illustration of how a protest is not necessarily going to be a very sustainable way of organizing people. It's very important to have one-on-ones because it increases the sustainability of your movement. So next slide, I believe. So, okay, actually, no, let's stay on this slide. So, so in terms of what a one-on-one is, and I'm sure a lot of you are already familiar with this, like, so one-on-one is a very intentional conversation where you're building a public relationship for action. So all of those elements are important to what makes it a one-on-one. It has to be two people. So it's specifically about that relationship. It has to be intentional, like you are setting aside time for it. You know why you want to have it. And you go in with particular goals and aims, and it has to be a public relationship. So it's not you talking to a friend about your relationship, but it's a conversation based around your shared interests and your values and your purpose, and developing a shared commitment to the work you're doing together, and also developing accountability around that work. So it typically involves an ask, so that you can hold yourselves accountable. And it's about the work. It's about figuring out steps to make your work, your movement building happen. So next slide. So one, like the COVID-19 pandemic, obviously, we can go to the next slide actually. So the COVID-19 pandemic obviously has had a lot of impact on one-on-one. So ideally a one-on-one would be one-on-one, like in person. But so the way a one-on-one looks has changed, but not a lot about how, like, what they are has changed. Like the content of one-on-ones are still the same, but how they happen is going to be different. So ideally you'll still be, like, once it's possible, you'd still have one-on-ones in person, because that's the best way to build a relationship. And now our one-on-ones are largely going to be digital. And that introduces new challenges, including that it's very awkward to sometimes video chat with people. It's difficult to interpret body language. Sometimes it can be difficult to be honest and open. And one way of sort of dealing with that is by being really open and vulnerable and being really honest. And that tends to help create stronger connections with people in what can be a really awkward sort of setting. And second, like another reason, another thing that's been changed by the move to mostly digital is that one-on-ones are going to be our main way of building relationships now, because we can't really do group mobilizing and group relationship building. So one-on-ones are going to be increasingly important, and that means that it's very important to determine who you have your one-on-ones with and make sure you're choosing people that can help you in your work and help you in your movement building. So yeah, so to talk about what makes for a good one-on-one and to give more like more specifics around one-on-ones, I'm going to hand it over to Katie.
Thank you, Shweta. And just to emphasize, meeting folks out in the streets is something we also have to do. It's just that to continue the work and to actually do the political change, we have to have those relationships to help keep us in the work. So we need both, yes and. So let's talk about what makes a good one-on-one. Billy, I'm gonna have you switch me to the next slide. So it's an exchange of stories. It's not a list of tasks. It's going to be public and about the work. And I mean public meaning like it couldn't be a friend that you're pulling into your, it can be a friend that you're pulling into your work, but it's public in that it's about this public facing work. It's not going to be about, you know, the nuances of a private friendship. So you're going to be rooted in your self-interest about a cause or an issue. You're not going to be convincing each other. You're going to find through your conversation what that shared interest is. It's going to be conversational. It's not going to be an interview where you're talking at someone. It will be a dialogue you have back and forth. And because it's going to be a natural conversation, you're going to have that natural curiosity to want to learn more about that person's story. And that will tell you more about what brought them to that issue. It doesn't mean that you're going to pry. It means that you're going to be vulnerable with each other and ask each other honest questions and give each other honest responses as much as you are comfortable, not pushing people beyond what healthy boundaries should be in a relationship. So the other very important thing about a one-on-one is there's usually an ask, and it could be a new relationship, but the ask can be to have a next conversation or things like that. It's not a one-time discussion. It's a relationship, meaning that it is going to go on and help you stay with your work and help bring that person into your work. And it may challenge your own conceptions or the other person's to think about something in a new way, whether it's a new tactic to take on your issue or just a new way of thinking about it. It's not going to be confrontational or argumentative. If this is somebody who's not interested in working with you, part of the one-on-one can be about finding who is good fit for working together. So we're going to really emphasize you're going to be forming for yourself what your self-interest is so that you can share that and listen to that in conversations with other people. Thank you, Billy. Okay, I want to really, really, really emphasize I've organized marches before and I didn't have one-on-ones with people. So it doesn't matter if you get 20,000 people to show up in a field and have that wonderful synergy of knowing you're all there for the same reason. Because if you don't then have a one-to-one with them, you're not going to be able to get them to then go and do door knocking or go and do other tactics to help you move the work forward. Relationships are the key to making this sustainable. How hard is it to work by yourself on a project? You need people to be working with you to give you fresh perspective so that you can stay in the work and not get exhausted too, so that you can take turns. So we're all going to work hard. We're going to be competing against all those things that are at our fingertips right now as we're in isolation. Gaming, Netflix, family commitments, work. But these relationships are so critical to establish so that you can stay in the work and help build your cause. There's so much to care about in the world. If you don't have these one-to-ones, you're going to lose sight of the direction you're taking your work or who you're representing in your work and things like that. So you've got to have those relationships. And a good example would be like, if I'm invited to a party, 9 times out of 10, I'm not going unless I know people already. It's similar for movement building. You've got to know people in the work. You've got to build those personal relationships. How many of you go to a party where you don't know anyone? All right, Billy. So you've all made the decision to come to this training. So we're going to talk a little bit about self-interest. So I recently had a one-on-one with somebody I didn't know. My colleague Alyssa introduced me via email. And so we just sort of had a fresh, out of the box, nothing really as an agenda, just knowing that Alyssa knows enough about both of us to connect us. And so we had a one-to-one, and I learned about her backstory and her work in how it's taken her in so many different directions, but how her commitment to anti-racism and healing as a white person has been an important part of her story and is the self-interest that moves forward all of her work. And we shared that common interest because as a mixed person, I'm also very deeply rooted in trying to work on anti-racism. So I don't know exactly where our work's going to go, but that was the beginning of this new relationship and how we're going to go forward together. So self-interest is a person's values. So talking about, why we believe what we believe and what makes us think about things differently and what motivates us to keep going with doing that movement work. So Caitlin and I both share anti-racism as our self-interest, but you can be thinking to yourself about issues and what brought you to that issue as your self-interest. Building people power is all about connecting those self-interests together and building those Venn diagrams that make these beautiful flowers. Thank you, Belly. Next one. So we're gonna see a video of our wonderful friends, Shweta and Billy, who is the invisible Wizard of Oz right now. But these are real humans. Shweta and Billy literally met for the first time to coordinate for this training. So for context, Billy just talked about how his progressive values were shaped by his upbringing. And we're going to talk about this conversation after we watch a segment of it. So Billy will get us started and we're going to skip to minute 22 or second 22.
Well, what you said really it resonated with me in terms of like it's sort of starting with like this early sort of consciousness in childhood. So like I grew up in an immigrant home, and I'm like Indian American, and I grew up like with very much a sense of otherness and of like being not a white person, but at the same time feeling very apolitical and not having like a very politicized racial identity. And a lot of that changed. I grew up in New York City, and there was very much like a sense of, there just wasn't a lot of like solidarity with other communities of color among like, it didn't feel like the API community really had a lot of common interests with other communities of color in the way I was raised. But then 9/11 happened when I was in middle school, and this was, you know, I was in New York City. And there was absolutely a sense, like a sea change I could feel, where we were suddenly a racialized community, and we were perceived as an other, like brown people generally. And that led me to feel a far greater sense of solidarity with other communities of color, and specifically with the Muslim community. So yeah, and that like motivated a lot of my interest in organizing and in sort of standing in solidarity with other people. And I'm a queer person, and like so as I sort of started my like journey in that realm, like I also became interested in how to organize as a queer person of color, and how to uplift the most marginalized people within my two communities, and how to bridge my identities together, and how to build power that way. And right now I'm on the board of an organization that is a social, political, peer support group for queer and trans South Asian people. And I do a lot of work with other queer API groups, and also other queer people of color groups, and just people of color groups generally, like Black Lives Matter in DC, like Black Pride, because DC is a Black city. And like fundamentally, I'm realizing that a lot of my role is allyship and working with other communities of color so we can uplift our sort of collective power in a variety, and I can talk more about what specific issues, but yeah, that's sort of my journey.
The part about sort of this absence of solidarity, do you feel that in DC like you did in New York?
Yeah, and I think like a lot of that comes from anti-Blackness that exists in a lot of API communities, and one of Asian and Pacific Islander. Yeah, sorry, all the acronyms. But yeah, like a big focus of my like work with this organization. The organization is called Kush DC, and other sort of groups I'm involved with is combating anti-Blackness within Asian communities, because that's a major sort of hurdle to real solidarity and to working with these communities. Like there's a lack of trust. But yeah.
I'm always curious about how people sort of develop those beliefs and those values. Where does that come from for you? How did you get to this point of bridging those gaps?
I think for me, like, so I have a master's in public health. I mean, obviously it started way earlier, just like greater political consciousness, greater reading when I was a kid, but on like a personal level. So I worked in Harlem for 2 years right after college at a direct service nonprofit, which was like a Head Start agency. So like, and it was like mostly Hispanic immigrants and who were served by this agency, and also Black kids. And I feel like, I just felt like it's very difficult to describe it. It's sort of like an emotional, like consciousness change where you sort of just feel greater solidarity, like just seeing like all of these immigrant journeys, like I felt like a real connection to my family's immigrant journey. So I think a lot of it is just basic empathy building, and also like combined with political consciousness raising, just like understanding better like how structural racism functions in this country and how it's been used by the white majority to divide people of color. So yeah, it's just been like a weird, long journey.
Yeah, it's funny, when I did similar to Head Start, I did 2 years of AmeriCorps.
Cool.
Here in DC, both through education. And the first school that I worked at, I was the only white person in the school. It was 100%, and not like making up those statistics. Like on paper, it was 100% Black. And yeah, I mean, I remember, to your point about sort of like consciousness raising, and like one of my fourth grade students very seriously asked me if I was mixed and asked me what I was.
Wow.
And when I asked her why, like, why did you feel the need to ask me that question, knowing that she was being very serious, like she was just a very curious, 9-year-old. She said, well, you work at a Black school. Like, why else would you be here? Which was just huge. Like, to see this 9-year-old understand systemic race, like at least experience that thing of division and segregation that we still have in this city.
Thank you all for taking the time to listen to that one-on-one. So we're going to walk you through a little thinking about what you took away from it. What did you like about this conversation? What did you want more of? So we're going to just have you think that to yourself. And I'd like you to take a minute and just put some thoughts in the chat. What did you like about the conversation? What did you want to see more of that maybe you didn't get to because we only had an excerpt? Where would you have taken the conversation? What questions would you have asked? Agreed. Jessica notes they were both coming from personal experience. Yeah, Paula appreciated the unpacking and of the upbringing and the relation to anti-Blackness. Yeah, Nancy notes they were both sharing vulnerable stories that changed their perspectives. Nikki notes active listening, finding solidarity with each other's experiences. Yeah, Natalie says they built off of each other. Yeah, we have to speak from our passion. Agreed, Claudia. Acknowledgement of privilege. Yeah, active listening, not just saying uh-huh. Great. Feel free to share more. These are great. Billy, I'm going to ask you for the next slide. Yeah, so what we call some of what you're calling out here are doors. So these sort of key questions here are ways to think about, this conversation you might be having, this one-on-one with whoever your person is. It's like a hallway. And as you go forward, you're going to have these little doors that kind of spark interest, and you can kind of look in them and you can keep going and go into a different hallway, or you can just stay in that hallway and decide to go into a different door. And so some of these key questions can help propel your conversation forward. So what is an example of a door that you heard between Shweta and Billy earlier in this conversation? Feel free to unmute yourself, or if you're more comfortable in the chat. What's a question they asked, or a story, or a vulnerability that was shared that kind of opened up a new scenario to go down? Well, I'll just kind of recall a couple of the things they talked about. They both talked about service experience. Yeah, okay. Matt says it made him recall why he got involved in organizing, the kind of awkward finding your way and how to be an ally? Absolutely. Absolutely. Yeah, I think especially with the reflection on how they had both done service work in communities that they didn't come from was a really like aha moment for both of them. Yeah, Shweta mentioned some of the kind of model minority issues with Asian Pacific Islanders. Absolutely, absolutely. What's something that you might do differently, or spur how you would do this conversation in your own scenario? Matt noted that the student Billy worked with, it stunned him that that 9-year-old person knew about structural racism. Yeah, I will tell you, I did not know about structural racism until I went to school. So 5. Yeah, I didn't know I was Asian until I went to school. I just thought I was a human. That's double-edged. Mom should have taught me about being Asian. Okay. Yeah, okay. So these doors are keys to one-on-one as far as it's going to help you find that self-interest. It's going to, these different topics are going to help you find where does your Venn diagram meet with your one-to-one person. So the fact that Shweta cares about community organizing is not her self-interest in and of itself. It's a fact about her. But finding out why she cares about something. So underline that thought in your mind. Why somebody cares about something and why she reacted the way she did, that's self-interest. That's her story. So you'll only get there by noticing a door with somebody you're having a one-to-one with and walking through it. So there's a lot of ways to get deeper into something, but these sample questions here on the door slide are examples of how you might open a door with someone. Okay. I'm going to circle back to the T chart, Billy, on the next slide. So when Shweta and Billy were speaking with each other, I heard stories. It was not a list of tasks or accomplishments. It was about the work. It was public. So Shweta was talking about Cush DC and how it interacted with her work with organizing people to learn more. I'm remembering part of the conversation that I'm not sure if we saw in that clip, but so I don't want to get ahead of myself, but it was about the work. It wasn't about, building a friendship with Billy. A friendship may come, but it was about the work and what brought them to the work and rooted in their self-interest. They weren't trying to sell to each other the idea of like, we should really work on anti-racism. They just vulnerably talked about what brought them to the types of work that they work on. It was conversational. It wasn't an interview where Billy was drilling down on like, so tell me about your resume, or tell me about why you went from XYZ to da, 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 da. It was a back and forth with lots of room and even time for some awkward silences to have natural exchange. And you could hear as Billy leaned in and this is what I want to emphasize, that curiosity can still be gotten at in this digital realm. And I do want to emphasize, this is going to get easier the more we learn the skill set, the more we practice this skill set, the more we share with each other about how to do this. It's okay to have awkward one-on-ones because these are people we maybe didn't meet in real life. And we're just going to try to be vulnerable with each other. And that first conversation will lead to the next conversation. In this one-to-one, we didn't get to the end of their conversation, but I'm sure there was an ask about, how they're going to continue to check back in with each other. It's not just a one-time conversation. And Billy asked some tough questions as far as like, what caused that mental shift? That wasn't like a softball question. That was a real like vulnerable ask of what brought Shweta to the work. But it was not at the expense of being confrontational or argumentative. Any questions about that? Because that's a lot to digest before we move on.
Yeah, I do. Is that okay? Do I go or?
Your question? Absolutely, please.
So, uh, what's the difference? So, a couple things. The first, some clarification. So, rooted in self-interest, that the self-interest of the task at hand, right?
Okay, so I think that's a great question, Matt. In this scenario, there was no task at hand. They were just having a one-on-one to establish the relationship. So if by the self-interest is what one's personal story is, as in what brought them to their movement work. And so they're sharing what their self-interest is and finding whether or not it matches. So when you're doing your first one-to-ones with people that, you know, maybe you didn't know before, you're looking to get a one-on-one that gets you to understand their self-interest, to get to that vulnerability where they might share what brought them to the work. And so when you just meet someone, you don't just launch into directly, so why the hell do you care about this stuff? You know what I mean? You're gonna have a little bit of chit chat, and then you're gonna have a little bit of conversation and nuance that's gonna get to those deeper questions where you've developed that trust essentially to ask, so why do you care about this work? Great question, Matt. All right, I don't see anything in the chat, and I'm gonna ask Billy questions is the next slide. So pardon, now I'm gonna hand it off to Shweta after the question slide. Okay.
So now we're going to send you into breakout groups again, and we're going to talk about a time when you built a relationship with someone and it made the organizing work you do more interesting, more possible feeling, and more fun. And also, if you have any tech difficulties, put them into the chat as before. Yeah, so we don't have time for a report back, sadly, but I'm sure you all had some interesting conversations, and if you want to report anything back, put it into the chat. So identify new relationships online. So we're going to talk a little about how you identify the people you want to have one-on-ones with. So next slide, please. So yeah, this is like a very incomplete list of some of the people you might choose to have one-on-ones with. So an easy place to start is people who follow you on social media and are active with your social media. So people who are liking your Facebook posts and also engaging with them. So like opening them, commenting on them, sharing them to other organizations, people who have high open rates on your emails, and new followers on Twitter. So people who attended your virtual event can also be interesting. So someone who is people like all of you. So like just like following up, because that shows like a clear level of interest, and also just like reaching out to your pre-existing networks and seeing people who you might share like self-interest with among your friends, among your family, and taking that private relationship on a more public level. And also, like, don't be afraid to just reach out to people who you admire and think are cool. Like, it's not weird. It's like an established thing, and just feel comfortable doing that. And we'll get some examples of that in the next slide. Next slide. So here are some ways of asking for a one-on-one in ways like people who you don't necessarily know. Here's like a pretty good template by Alyssa, the director of Rising Organizers, reaching out to someone who she has common interest with and knows like through some like common relationships, but does not know personally. So it's very simple. It's her introducing herself, being very direct. And here are some text-based like examples of one-on-ones below that are also super simple and direct. Next slide. So here's some like basic building blocks, like when you're sending that email or sending that text, like things to keep in mind. Tell them who you are, tell them just specifically why you want to talk to them, and also mention any relationships you have in common. So as you can see in this sample one-on-one, so Billy introduces himself, explains the common relationship he has with the person he's talking to, and also gives an example, like gives sort of like a concrete reason for why he wants to talk, and also like sort of establishes some common interest. And it's also like a good basic practice for the early one, like at least your first one-on-one with a person to be on video, so you have like, it's better for relationship building. Next slide. And it's really important after your one-on-one to not let that relationship just sort of fade away. So it's really important first on your personal level to think about what you did well, what you didn't do well and might change in the future, and also the implications of that conversation for your movement and for your work. And also always like make sure to follow up on your asks, whether that be inviting the person to another training or introducing them to new people that might be relevant to their self-interest. Next slide. Any questions? If you have questions, feel free to put them in the chat. So next slide. Yeah, so now as we're starting to wind down, just like the key takeaways are that organizing people is a core method of gaining power, and especially contending with organized money. One-on-ones help you build those sustainable one-on-one relationships, obviously. So like the kinds of relationships you can't necessarily build through mobilizing, through a direct action, through a protest, like the one-on-one conversations will make your work much more sustainable. And just like for like digital one-on-ones, they can be uncomfortable at first, but it's okay. And it's normal for it to be weird, but it's, that's just an established sort of factor of how we live now. And it's fine for it to be weird. And also use digital tools to identify who to have one-on-ones with. So look at who's following you on social media, look at who's like really actively engaging with you, and get to know them better. Next slide. I don't want that. This is, I hate that video. You want,
Wait.
that video just represents how awkward the beginning of a one-on-one can be. So it's the first
22 seconds.
Yeah.
Oh, video, sound.
So it's just like how extremely awkward it can be to start a digital one-on-one. Like I didn't know who Billy was talking to. I didn't know if I was talking to him. I didn't know who he was. So it's probably going to start out awkward because this is just an awkward way to communicate with people, but that's fine. Yeah, and so we have a lot of other trainings coming up around digital organizing, which may be helpful as you build on these skills. So we have an intro to digital organizing coming up on June 5th, combating tactics of the powerful on June 10th, and grassroots organizing during COVID on June 15th, which will include perspectives from other graduates of the Rising Organizers Fellowship Program. Yeah, and we also provide organizational training. So next slide. And the next slide is just this beautiful graphic. So yeah, like just definitely follow us on social media and keep an eye out for upcoming trainings around digital organizing. We have a question. Can you tell us a little more about the digital organizing training and what it will be about? So Alyssa, do you want to take that? Or Katie?
Sure, I'm just putting our email in the chat as well as mine and Billy's in case people want to one-on-one. But we're having recurring digital organizing trainings because even though folks are at home, there are still ways to get organized. Our last one focused on, text and email, and Alyssa can chime in on the specialty of who will be co-training for this time. But I imagine we're going to hit on some of those strong points as well again. But essentially, as you build a cohort of people who are working alongside you, some of them more peripheral than others, you want to keep communicating with them. And digital organizing is all about how to keep those conversations going about what work you're doing and what tactics you're going to be taking before or after, any sort of organizing meetings and things like that.
Hello. So the digital organizing training is to add on, everything Katie said is correct. And what essentially the thesis of the training is, how is it that we can teach you how to best leverage digital tools like Facebook and email and things like that to build power over the long term. it is, if you've been to a digital organizing training before, I think you'll find it to be pretty similar to those. If you are looking for ways to expand your knowledge of organizing in the digital space, if you have not been to a digital organizing training before, it's a really good laying the ground of some best practices on social and email and that kind of thing. So I hope that answers your question. And it will also be run by one of our alums who is a digital person at a nameless but very important political organization, I will say.
We do our best to speak from experience and learn from each other. So all about the skill sharing, y'all. I want to thank you all for coming. It is 2:02. Thank you for spending this hour with us. The slide deck / recording will be shared with you all. Please take note of our email addresses. Go ahead and copy and paste them from the chat and start an email to us. We'll make time. We appreciate your time. Thank you all. Additional thanks to my co-presenter, Shweta. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thank you.